All right, welcome everybody to today's presentation. My name is Lori Sylvie. I'm the president of the Center for Business Management at the Illinois Chamber of Commerce. Today's webinar is Illinois in the Bullseye, Challenges and Opportunities in the New Norm. Before I introduce the presenters for the day and we get started, I'll just give you a few notes of logistics for the participants. Everyone is muted in order to minimize any background noise. If you have a question during the presentation, there are two options. There's a question box on the lower right-hand side of the screen, or there's a chat box, and you can type your question into either one. I'll get it on my screen and I'll relay it to our moderator for the Q&A today. And at this point, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Laura Ortega, the Executive Director of the International Business Council.
Thank you, Lori. Can you hear me fine?
I mean, it's all done, the floor and the furniture and everything's done? It's ready to use?
Hello?
Go ahead, Laura.
Hello?
Yep, we can hear you.
Good. So thank you, Lori, for the introduction. Good morning, everybody, or good evening. You are joining us today from a different time zone. Thank you for participating in today's program, curated by IBC member company and top global real estate consultancy, Newmark Knight Frank, and presented by Robert Hess, its vice chairman for global corporate services, and John Evans, founding partner and managing director of Tractus Asia Limited. Thank you both for your willingness to lend your time, your brain, and your experience of over 25 years doing business across the globe. We are coming to the end of IBC Critical Information webinars, and this time I would like to conclude the series with a message of hope, resilience, and reimagination for our companies and all the economic stakeholders involved in reshaping the economy. Businesses all sizes and across all countries had to grapple during these 6 months with an unprecedented social and economic disruption that has reshaped the way that we think and the way that we consume and do business. Companies have been forced in a very short time to throw their existing models and strategies to adapt to a content-free world and that has spanned or accelerated new trends, technologies, and consumer behaviors. As we restore the global economy, we must see and use this crisis as a catalyzer for change and opportunity to rethink the fundamental structure of business, labor, sectors, and the overall economy. No one better than our speakers today to discuss these changes and novel trends and how they can be leveraged to develop new opportunities and better opportunities for the state of Illinois. Mr. Hess and Mr. Evans have been working together all over the world for many, many years, and they bring a unique perspective to topics like supply chain strategies, investment, relocation, foreign direct investment, and how those economic challenges are going to be met not just by a private sector, but also as a state competes with other countries and other regions in the world to gain investment and companies moving into our region. And with that, I would like to briefly introduce our first speaker, John Evans. And after that, Mr. Evans will start his discussion at a macro level. And John Evans will introduce Robert Hess right after, and Robert Hess will address fundamentally issues that are related to our regional market here in Illinois and how to better compete in the world. After that, we'll have a Q&A, and I will thank everybody for staying with us today and our speakers, and after that, we will conclude our program. So Mr. Evans is a founding partner and the managing director of Tractus Asia Limited, which is a Asia-based advisory providing both public and private sector trade and investment assistance. Over the years, Mr. Evans and the firm have advised on more than $5 billion in trade and investment transactions across a wide variety of sectors. Mr. Evans has been a leader and instrumental in the development and growth of the firm on 4 practice areas: economic development, strategy and execution, corporate finance, and a structured business incubator, which is a low-cost, low-risk platform for companies to enter and compete in the developing Asian economy. Mr. Evans sits on several boards in Asia and has been an investor into several early stages technology and manufacturing companies targeting the Asian growth market. John currently serves on the board of trustees of Princeton in Asia and is a former board member of Princeton's Institute for International and Regional Studies. He often writes articles, gives lectures, participates in interviews, and is featured in publications such as The Economist, the Wall Street Journal, and has spoken at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, as well as in U.S. trade investment offices. He earned his degree in East Asian History at Princeton University, is fluent in Thai and Spanish, and has basic Mandarin Chinese knowledge. And with that, John, please take the floor, and it's all yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm calling in from Bangkok, Thailand, which is where we founded the firm and is our operating headquarters. And I'm a displaced Midwesterner. I'm originally not from Illinois, but not too far away in Minnesota, and have spent the past 25 plus years here in Asia, but connecting Asia and the United States, in particular the Midwest. Thank you for the introduction and the background on the firm. What I'm hoping is that through some of the insights that I can provide by working with private sector companies and economic development agencies, it can help some of the Illinois companies to think about how they're going to look at business growth moving forward now in the future, particularly post-COVID. I think also a very relevant point to bring up is that our firm works with many US states now on their trade and investment promotion strategies in Asia, and I can leverage some of that experience to talk about what the state can do to best position itself. So thank you. Next slide. So I'm going to start and just talk at a very high level, and you're probably wondering why we're, here there is a faded map of China behind my bullets. And I think there's a little historical reference that's needed before I start speaking about today. And, for the past 25 years, there was this mad rush of manufacturing into Asia Pacific, particularly into China. And China, through a combination of cost effectiveness, efficiency, government support, and a few other factors, quickly became the manufacturer of the world, much to the disappointment of the United States and its manufacturing, as well as much of the world. And so while that occurred over the past 2 decades, it's important to note that as we get into recent history, things have really started to change. And prior to this past year, there were a number of factors that were contributing to this change. Costs were increasing, the globalization of manufacturing and supply chains had really been achieved. While costs were not equal across the world, they were becoming much closer to equal. And so it was no longer a labor arbitrage factor. And China, quite honestly, started to become in many sectors less competitive, and in some sectors not competitive. And then the other thing that's happened in the last decade is that risk mitigation has taken on a much more important role in the corporate C-suite as investors and companies are looking at doing business globally. And there were some interesting events that happened, both black swan and gray swan events that emanated in Asia. And I can go historically and talk about them: the Japanese Fukushima reactor, the Thailand 100-year flood, the SARS pandemic, and then more recently the Hong Kong protests, or probably most importantly, before we get to COVID, the US-China trade tensions. And these factors really started to have companies looking at where they were putting their eggs and did they have too many eggs in the China basket. But up until the US-China trade war, most of the efficiencies in China, because it had invested in creating a manufacturing infrastructure and support services and clusters, it was still hard to look at moving away. So we fast forward and we get to the end of the US-China trade tensions, of the signing of the Phase 1 agreement, and after a very, very tenuous relationship for about 18 months, there was a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel that the Xi administration and the Trump administration were coming to terms on cooperating between the world's largest and second largest economy, and that it was going to be beneficial for both economies, but particularly for the US, who did win many of the things in concessions from China that it was looking for. And so as that moves forward, what happens is COVID-19 occurs, and it really makes the world turn upside down. And so while this balancing of global manufacturing has started and companies are looking at where should we be and how should we be investing near market, things get turned upside down. Next slide, please. So COVID-19 has devastated most businesses. And there was a survey done not too long ago by a group called the Management Supply Chain Group, and they looked at just a number of factors and interviewed 700 US multinationals. 80% of the companies knew, this was in early March, they were going to be negatively impacted by COVID. 60% all knew that they were going to have doubled lead times in their supply chain because much of it was coming from the areas impacted, which were Asia. And then 45% of them didn't have any alternatives in their supply chain and were particularly nervous about it. And so if you go back to February, March, this was a scenario as the COVID, at that time, epidemic, and I'm saying epidemic versus pandemic because it was really centered on China and some of the Asian countries, impacted our global supply chain and businesses. Next slide, please. Fast forward, and here we are now, we're in the end of May, beginning of June now, middle of June, and I think the data here is from the end of May. And what has occurred? Well, coming from someone like myself who's been based in Asia for 25 years, we had a head start on COVID. We had a head start on the pandemic, and Asia has a head start on its recovery. And many of the Asian nations have done a really good job through a combination of whether it is government mandates and lockdowns or just natural social distancing, adherence to best practices of washing your hands and wearing masks. And we found that a lot of the Asian nations' recovery is now faster in getting back to the overused term of the new normal. But what is really interesting is if you look at where Asia is, for the most part, and it's not all of Asia, because there are certainly some countries in Asia that have not recovered as fast, India being one of them, which is right in the middle of the worst part of the viral curve. But Asia is ahead of the US by leaps and bounds and ahead of much of Europe, but not all of Europe. And so from an economic perspective, I think there is a serious need, if you're sitting in Illinois, to look at what can we do in terms of trade and how can we attract Asian investors, because their business is coming back first. Next slide. So I'm not going to read the data on the left-hand side. This is just some of what's happening in terms of reopening the economies and coming out of the lockdowns. I think more importantly, the big question that gets asked oftentimes to economists in the US is, will post-COVID be a V shape, a U shape, a very slow, long recovery. And I think so far, most economists think that the US economy is in for a longer recovery. However, when the World Bank evaluated what they thought would happen with Asia Pacific, if you look at this, it's very much a V. 2020 is negative with the exception of a couple of countries in terms of their growth. One of those is Vietnam, who did an extremely good job of pushing the viral curve down. And the other one is China. But then you look at the forecast for 2021, these are not only robust or equaling 2019, they're exceeding it. And so I'm using this Asian example as, again, a place where Illinois businesses need to look for trade opportunities as well as investment opportunities. And even if the World Bank is wrong, which they're likely to be, okay, they're probably not wrong by a magnitude. And so if you look at that, even if it was half that growth, it's probably still better than you're going to see in much of the rest of the world. Next slide, please. This is a really interesting analysis. It's a little hard to read, but if you look at the two axes, it's mobility and recovery. And so if you look at the x-axis, it's mobility, and the y-axis is recovery. And so the countries that are up in the upper right-hand quadrant are the ones that have had the greatest mobility, made the greatest changes to their business practices, their social distancing practices, and they are coming out faster of the recovery. And so it just proves the point I was making earlier. And then if you look back, unfortunately, the US is lagging down in that bottom left-hand corner where it has a low level of mobility and a low level of recovery. Some of the other countries outside of the Asian ones, there are some significant European markets that are also, while not as high in the mobility, are high on the recovery. And I think that this means two things. One, international markets, both in Asia and the EU, are going to be extremely important to Illinois companies and to attracting investment from those regions into Illinois. Next slide, please. This one is just simply to demonstrate while the exports from Illinois to China have dropped significantly, as you would expect them to have dropped during the trade war in 2019, that and overall exports have dropped in 2019, that the largest amount in terms of value of exports is the EU. And so looking at that global market as a continued export destination, and then ex-China, if you look at 2019, which is a year that really struggled because of the US-China trade war, the rest of the ASEAN, this Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the 10 countries there, were quite strong in terms of an export destination. And we're seeing a lot of states now relook at their strategies. And while China can't be taken off of the table as a target, it's the world's second largest economy. It's recovering much faster than the United States. There are still political uncertainties. We don't know what will happen come the election in November in the United States. But I can tell you, having spent more than 2 decades working in China, that the Chinese will be conservative and slow in how they approach the US going forward because of what's happened in the recent history. And so when I look at the export markets, I again look to global markets as the area that Illinois companies really need to focus on, particularly as we move on in 2020 and in 2021. Unless we see that robust V recovery in the US, it's likely to be markets outside of the US that will provide the greatest growth and profit for companies. Next market, please. Next slide. Oops. So FDI going into Illinois. This is just a highlight as of the end of the third quarter in 2019. And if you look at this, it's with the exception of Canada and then Japan being an Asian investor, it's highly dominated by European companies. And those companies are employing a lot of people in Illinois. And so again, doubling down and looking at your European strategy, in particular, the countries that are rebounding, Switzerland, Austria, Germany, even Italy, with all of its COVID issues, is now, from an economic standpoint, coming back quite strongly. And then where you're not seeing foreign direct investment into Illinois is from Asia, and with the exception of Japan. But Japan and Korea should be big targets. China should be a long-term target. Southeast Asia, it should certainly be a target. There are large companies, large conglomerates in that region that are actively looking at investing in the U.S., both in greenfields and M&A, and are not that hard to get in front of or target, because they have not been targeted by a lot of states at this point. And then Indian investment, once they get through their COVID curve, is going to be one of the fastest growers. And so those are all opportunities for Illinois. Next slide, please. So COVID-19, are you a winner? Are you a loser? Or are you in between? And I think that a lot of people don't yet realize the devastation to the economy that is occurring due to the pandemic. And, just looking at the unemployment numbers, more than 30 million persons unemployed in the US, that's not going to come back that fast. Looking at certain sectors, real estate, the demand for real estate is going down. Dine-in restaurants that weren't able to deliver food or do delivery of or takeout of food. Traditional retail has been decimated. Tourism and travel across the world, hotels are about 90% negatively impacted by the COVID slowdown. The automobile industry, to buy automobiles, you need disposable income. And automobile is a big purchase. And when people are losing their jobs or they're being asked to take wage reductions, they get more conservative. They don't buy automobiles. And then one that may surprise people is ocean freight, because on a logistics side, as the exports dropped off around the world and the trade dropped off, the ships ended up sitting empty a lot of the time. On the opposite side, winners, and I talked already, food delivery, med tech, pharma, biotech, media and gaming. E-commerce. We're using GoToMeeting now. I think there was an article that said the value of Zoom in 3 months went from, and I don't remember the number, but I think it was a pretty small number, to the value of the world's 7 largest airlines combined. Now, of course, the airlines were losers in that, so they were going down at the same time. E-commerce has been booming, financial and risk advisory. And then what happens if you're in the middle? What if you're sitting in the middle and you're a bricks and mortar retailer with e-commerce? So you're kind of floating along. You're a restaurant, but you have some delivery. You're an educational institution or academic institution that's now going online to sell. Hospitals and dental, while necessary, so they had customers, were difficult to visit. Insurance and banks, they don't seem to go away regardless. And then trucking was both negatively impacted by not going to the ports, but positively impacted that it was delivering goods to people who were at home or needed it where they were going. Next slide, please. Some Illinois companies, and how are they faring? And these are just some examples of some big public companies. If you look at it, not surprisingly, Caterpillar, Abbott, Allstate, they're all coming back over, the last 6 months to sort of the level they were at. Maybe surprisingly, Walgreens, which is in that, the pharmacy area, is dropped off a bit. And then, of course, Boeing, with its problems it had with the 737 MAX, but now with a decreased and sort of grim outlook on the future of business travel, has certainly fallen. But there are some good performers, and I think that you need to look internally in the state and say, not only from a publicly listed company standpoint, but where are the SMEs and where are the mid-cap companies that are performing well, and why are they performing well? Next slide, please. So if I'm one of those companies sitting in the middle in Illinois, or has been, or been successful, or perhaps has been really hurt by this, but I haven't gone under yet, you need to ask yourself some questions. Are you prepared for the economic resurgence? Will it be a resurgence? Will it be a slow recovery? And making sure that your business model fits with that. You've probably at this point made it through most of the crisis management. You've let go most of the people you had to let go. You've reduced your costs. But then you need to start thinking about going forward and mitigating risks, because your business is more susceptible to smaller risks now that can impact it more, because it's not as robust or not as profitable in a lot of cases if you're in that middle area. And then what happens if there's a second viral wave or a continued wave, as it looks like we're seeing now in the US, and what do you do? And so one of the things we're advising our clients is, most companies plan in a 3-year business time. Step back, redo your business plan. Look at it objectively. Where are you in that new normal and in the new business scenario, and really sharpen the pencil and look at what are you going to achieve in 3 years, and is it realistic? Next slide, please. So here's some funny graphics, but also just some thoughts. If I'm one of those in-betweener companies, I want to look at, can I change my strategy? And I know re-strategize is not a word, but can we do something differently? And there's some really good examples of that. One of the global hotel chains looked at how in Asia, instead of firing everyone, they could become the location to quarantine people that were coming back into the country, and have successfully stayed open. There are other hospitality restaurant conglomerates that shut down. I can give an example in Thailand. One of the largest group shut down all its hotels, but transferred all those people into its pizza business, because the pizzas took off and went crazy. The other thing is that the supply chain in manufacturing has really, over the last decade, been looking at adopting artificial intelligence, automation, and this is going to continue. And not only in the machinery side of things, but in the soft side of things, in the people side of things. They're going to demand higher technical labor and more capabilities to bring on. And then I think right now, nobody wants to get rid of people. You've been forced to do that. But one of the things companies need to really think about, do you have people that are not the right fit, perhaps underperforming? And this is the time to, unfortunately, let them go, and then hire the people that are best practice, that are going to help you grow. And then just, for the winners, the companies that that have been opportunistic, or have changed their strategy, or been in the right place with the right product during this time, consider new economic expansion into new geographies, new product lines. Really aggressively grow now where competition is hurting, and then growth through mergers and acquisitions. And whether you're an in-betweener and you may be giving up equity and it's not something you want to do, it can keep you afloat, and it can help you scale the business. Or for those companies that have been successful, they're cashed up, they can go out and acquire. Right now, the private equity dry powder, the money sitting on the sidelines from 2019, was at an all-time high. So there's a lot of money to invest in companies, and it's a good time for Illinois companies to go out and look for that capital to then expand into new markets. And like I said earlier, looking at the EU and looking at Asia. Next slide. So with that, I get the great privilege and honor of introducing Bob Hess. And I don't have Bob's bio here, so I'm not going to go through his academic credentials or talk about his work credentials, specifically who he worked with. But this is a great opportunity for me as the student to acknowledge the teacher. And so when I started my career, both Bob and I were working for a Chicago-based firm called PHH Fantas. It was the global leader in site selection, and Bob got to train me. And I couldn't have had a better mentor or a better teacher. And so I was, after a little bit of training by Bob, I was, kicked out of the US and kicked out of Chicago and relocated to Asia. And then my education continued as Bob and I worked on many projects with Fantis. And then after Fantis, both with the formation of my firm, Tractus, and then throughout Bob's career, we've just had a tremendous working relationship. And so now I get to sit back and I've shared what I've learned in my experiences, and I'll turn it over to the master to talk a little bit more about Illinois and what he sees going forward.
Thank you, John. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I'm really excited to be here. I moved to Chicago back in 1985 with chairs and silverware in my back seat. Lived in Rogers Park, and my first job was on the 33rd floor of the Prudential Plaza. My boss at that time was a gentleman named Bob Adey, who became co-founder of World Business Chicago. And I remember, and I got a chance to work with Bob and the masters of corporate site selection on many of the clients you see here. And of course, many of these clients are new clients. And this is where I take my cue from, is understanding what all these companies are thinking in the boardroom, where they invest, where they innovate, where they spend their time. And believe me, they're all doing scenario planning right now. And the context I want to bring today is an excitement I felt back when I came to Chicago and Illinois back in the mid-'80s. It was a time when we were planning and talking about corridors of opportunity, and the public and private sector were working very closely together. Right now, we have a $76 billion hit to our state's economic output, they say, by March of 2021. That is a big number, and it's hard not to focus on this. But the spirit of my presentation is on things like separating ourselves from the pack, rethinking, reimagining, self-awareness and pivoting, transformation thinking, and just keeping a key eye to what others are thinking. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. So this is about me, a person living in Illinois, all of you being in Illinois, and how we're going to compete for jobs and precious investment moving forward. Next slide. And scenario planning is back. That's the first thing my boss asked me to do back in February. It's like, what are the scenarios of the future based upon what was impacted by COVID that inform the present? And this is a time to do scenario planning. It's a time for the state of Illinois at all levels of the government, all levels of the private sector to work together to look at these scenarios. And I'll highlight the two in the middle: changing approach to portfolio and community, and of course, altered supply chain manufacturing and retail. There's reconfiguring, rethinking. John talked about footprints changing. And then of course, there's also transformation of globalization, balancing regulation, trust, and anxiety. That sounds like a real soft factor right now, but regulation and trust shifts towards a more socially responsible platform. That's in the news, right? That this speech is not about that, but these are real factors that impact companies' investment, their talent, where they spend their time, how they look at social issues, and how that might impact investments. So again, scenario planning is back, and it's a really important thing for us all to keep in mind. Next slide. And everybody's looking at the most impacted industries. We've taken a shot at that too. I think many of these align with John. I think this is something you'll see when we send the presentation out to you. E-commerce is huge right now. Warehousing, look at the Amazon effect that still continues on. Of course, health and pharmaceutical, biotech, medical equipment. It's a very active sector. We just announced the project in Raleigh-Durham area. Actually it accelerated during COVID-19 in terms of the project itself. And of course, this gets into PPE and life science and many different sectors. And of course, on the right are the negatively affected industries. And of course, these are industries we're not going to leave behind. They all require the rethinking and reimagining in terms of how they're going to position themselves, or how we retrain and educate displaced workers out of those sectors. I'll call them transferable skills from the right to the left, right? That's what the little cartoon is up there. How do the public and private sectors work together to make sure the right understands the left, and make sure that we're creating that collaboration for bringing people back into a productive mode. Next slide. I am a corporate site selector. I've been here in Illinois since 1985 and worked with some of the best in the business. But I work with a lot of corporate site selectors around the globe, including John, and about 50 in an organization called the Site Selectors Guild. This was our April 21st survey. We have another coming out soon, where these are the people that are working in the boardroom. These are the top site selectors in the world. These are my peers, and we asked them what are the most active industries. So there you go. This is something policymakers, and I like what Laura said, we got to think about policy and where we spend our time and kind of point the rifle, not the shotgun, right? A rifle with a scope on it in terms of our resources, time and effort, job creation, et cetera. You can see the industries there in that chart: biotech, life science, transportation, logistics, advanced manufacturing. We have 3 small manufacturing projects in-house right now. I know there's plenty of service providers that have no projects going on. But again, these are active sectors. Software and IT is looking at de-densifying, lower cost centers, remote locations. Do I need to be in San Francisco? Can I be in Effingham? As an example. I'm not kidding you, by the way. That's a real scenario. So those are industries that come to mind. And then on the right, the types of functions: warehousing, production, back office, R&D. There's some interesting trends here too. If you just change safety stock right now in the e-commerce warehousing area, and you've heard industrial is going to be hot, right? That's an extra, just a 5% change in safety stock because of the delivery mechanisms required now in the post-COVID. That's an extra billion square feet of warehousing, 1 billion. And everybody wants a piece of that. Not only Illinois, but all the states surrounding us and across the country. They're competing for this investment. And then the same thing on the reshoring. China has 90 million manufacturing jobs, and everybody thinks you're going to reshore all those jobs. No. If you just look at 1% of that, 1% of 90 million, do the math. So again, who's going to compete for this 9 million, basically 9 million jobs, or more like 1 million jobs, I think. But still, it's a very, very competitive sector. So again, this is about competing. So what is the Illinois policy on economic development? How are companies playing into that? These are real factors right now. And now's the time, carpe diem, to understand where you want to spend your time and resources. Next slide. And then here's a quick slide. Data centers, by the way, we have new legislation in the state of Illinois. That is really sparking a lot of interest for cloud companies. All the FANGs, that stands for the Facebook, Apple, et cetera, all the big tech firms. Data centers are hot, and that was a good thing the state of Illinois put data center legislation in place in terms of data center incentives. So data centers, industrial, life science, again, be thinking about these industries. This might be short-term or long-term, but again, it's about right now where you spend your time in terms of resources, targeting the right places, and again, what are our current ecosystems and resources here in the state of Illinois on the data center cloud side, industrial, different sectors, life science. Everybody should be in life science. Illinois has a life science cluster. I don't think it's promoted very well. It's not well known, and I'll give you an example in a second, but it should be. Next slide. And then lastly, future predictions for work. I'll let you read these, but John talked about several of these. I can tell you one thing right now, there's a lot of big consulting firms sitting in boardrooms of companies talking about all the ideas for cost control and cost cutting. And that might be actually moving things around, changing their business models, leaving 50% of their people working from home. That means they may not be commuting back to the Loop or back to certain city centers and other cities in Illinois. How's that going to change neighborhoods, communities, transportation infrastructure? Talent is in the bullseye here right now. And then also infrastructure and broadband, being able to work from home. Just think about these things. So if you just look at this slide, that's a lot of policy development, but you can't ignore it. We have to think about these factors and these trends and rethink everything. Next slide. So I'm going to take you through a quick journey. And so for the person helping me with the slides, there's going to be a lot of next slides coming up, but Illinois competitiveness. So I really care about the state of Illinois. I'm originally from Wisconsin. I've been here since 1985. I'm raising 2 special needs daughters, my wife, I have family here. And this is an opportunity. There needs to be a new re-energy around combating and changing the narrative around things like this. This is what CEO Magazine says about Illinois. I'll let you read it. And being 48th and 46th and 44th, you can debate on how you do this. But this is the news in the marketplace. And now's the chime. Is it a burning platform? No. And there's plenty of others where we're rated number 1 or 2. We'll talk about that. But again, just think about this context. Now's the time to be addressing these issues, understand them, what's real, what's perceived. Next slide. Again, the conversely, the opportunities about how we've been resilient through this change. And I think Illinois has done an excellent job considering this, putting tough policies in place. Look at Wallet had to say. And here's my own quote. I'll let you read my own quote. There's a lot to be building on here. So if you go to the next slide, what is perception matters, right? So what's the story? So the CEO magazine and that perspective, and again, you can't ignore that. I mean, there's things around costs and business climate we'll talk about, are all the great things going on here. And I'm not just talking about Chicago. This is all of Illinois, the rural Illinois, the Decaturs, the Quad Cities, the Effinghams, the metropolises. So what's the real narrative for Illinois moving forward? I mean, this is the really, really important matter. Now is the time for new energy, new public and private sector participation, and truly a strategic plan from the state and all the relative quarters around the state to address the bad and the ugly and the good, and to focus on the right. Next slide. And business cost is one of those. And that's, when you look at all those industries that John talked about and these clusters and ecosystems, the bottom line, profitability and competitiveness will always be in the boardroom. And that's where I spend most of my time, is developing alternatives and choices in the boardroom when our clients look at where they invest and which states and which countries. And they always want to look at all the recurring costs and one-time costs. Next slide. And here's an example. So this is the current life science project right now. We did look at Chicago initially. This is a Bay Area company trying to establish manufacturing outside of California. And there's challenges out there. This is an actual cost stack up. So this is what John and I do for a living. When the COO and the head of supply chain and head of operations says, hey, what are my opportunities and where are the best locations and clusters? And so they're going to look at this cost dynamic. Is that where you think Chicago really should fall? That's a big savings against California. But look at these other competing locations, right? So there's competition out there, and you really got to understand your structural costs by each segment, by each industry. Labor, real estate, taxes, these are all real factors. Next slide. And this was an actual project where we were hired to look at whether they should stay or leave Illinois. And you'll see some of these other communities in here that showed a cost savings. Nashville, Tennessee, Greenville, South Carolina. This was a company based in Wakanda. And this is actually went right to the president, the COO of the company. These are things that we look at. So which of these cost factors are controllable or non-controllable? Are there ways that we can continue to make Illinois more competitive? This gets into lots of policy issues. This gets into infrastructure. What about electric power? By the way, Illinois has some of the lowest electrical power costs in the nation. People don't know that. I've sat with ComEd and looked at it. I was flabbergasted at some of their electric power rates. But again, it's about marketing and branding and positioning the reality of things. For this client, though, they were concerned about their cost structure moving forward and some tax environment issues. Next slide. And that brings up the business climate. If you hit the next slide, this is out there in the news. Again, is this reality? So again, this is a stack up of Illinois versus other states. In terms of our corporate income tax rate, sales tax rate. I was just on a call yesterday with a client. They're going to be investing a lot of new capital. So they said, is there a sales tax exemption in the state of Illinois? I said, yes, that's big dollars for them. So versus other states where it's no. So again, this is about competitiveness, and these are real unit costs that all of our clients are looking at. Look at that electric power cost, 12.3 cents in California. So again, where do you spend your time? What industries, what factors and industries do you have an advantageous cost structure for, and others not? This is in the news. It's in Cranes and Chicago Tribune every day about tax climate. And it's back in the news now again as we come out of COVID-19 and look at this future GDP and move into this hockey stick recovery. Next slide. Same thing around personal taxes. Do we want to be in the red? Is that really true? Again, might not be, everybody's going to debate this, but this is what you see from the tax foundation and a lot of things. So it's an important thing where you can go to state where no personal income taxes. Next slide. And then incentives. Illinois has never been a big competitor in this area. Again, that's a huge policy on retention incentives, attraction incentives. There's a lot of states right now that are going to be super challenged with COVID-19. Their budgets are going to be hit. Where they spend their money, it's got to help the people in the communities. Of course, we've been hearing about care packages and federal assistance, state assistance. But I can tell you right now, all of these states are revisiting their incentive policies. Is Illinois doing that? I know they're in legislation talking about, should they keep things? Should they target towards the life science sector? So they changed their data center legislation. Nobody stops in the United States or around the world, John hopefully will agree with this, about competing and positioning their geography relative to attracting jobs and retaining jobs. So we got to look at this incentive policy moving forward. Next slide. Real estate and facilities, if you hit the next slide, we are currently involved in looking at the state of Illinois for a very large site-driven project. And the state, it's important to have certified shovel-ready sites. This is another factor. So the real estate portfolio of the state, I'm not getting into the developers or buildings. There's the real estate industry, they can talk about that, but this is important. This is the time to evaluate that inventory and position yourself for these targeted industries that are going to be in recovery. What type of sites do they need? This is about water, sewer, electric power, sites themselves, infrastructure, road systems. Very, very important. This is an important factor. All the states surrounding Illinois have done a shovel-ready certified sites program. Illinois, I believe, is behind in this, and we got to catch up very quickly because this is a really important part of having product on the shelf when the companies come and knocking. Next slide. Infrastructure, I mentioned that. If you go on to the next slide, this is in the news. It's a federal issue. The United States typically gets a D- from the American Society of Civil Engineers, where we spend our times, roads, bridges, infrastructure, water, sewer. We can't have Flint, Michigans happen again. And this is also something that's got to be on the radar in terms of, all of these factors and how they stack up to the other states. Infrastructure is in the bullseye also. Next slide. Talent workforce. Now we're talking about competitive advantages on the positive side. If you go on to the next slide, how do you benchmark the state of Illinois and look at all these factors? Workforce capacity and pipeline, talent capacity, attractiveness, the business environment. Illinois does pretty well. Chicago's a world-class city when it comes to talent. I work in the Loop and I see it every day on the train, walking around, tremendous talent, tremendous universities, some of the best in the world. So how do we leverage, how we brand that, how we advance that, continue to invest in our universities? Very, very important factor. Next slide. Benchmarking, you can look at, you can't read all this, but we just prepared this. So this is what the first thing, all those companies I showed you, those logos up front and John showed you, they're all doing this. They're benchmarking workforce, cost, education level, education attainment. By the way, diversity. We're seeing a new job title pop up with our clients called Chief Cultural or Diversity Officer. By the way, that's something that's been around for a long time, and it should be. It's even more accentuated these days in terms of making sure we have a diverse perspective, diverse workforce, up and down the organization. And then, of course, obviously the wage index. So there's lots of different factors here. So again, the question is how does Illinois stack up? What's changed? What can we improve? What are our gaps? And how do we position ourselves, right? Self-awareness, and then pivot to areas where we can compete. Next slide. And this is a good one right here. Look at this information is about software engineers in the workforce. Software development, software engineers, tech innovation, a big driver for any economy. Look at Illinois. Certainly, obviously, focused on the Chicago area, and of course, U of I. My nephew graduated with a PhD down there. He's originally from Minnesota. Love the university. There's a competitive advantage. Is this something we position all the time, nationally and internationally? Again, these are competing clusters and ecosystems for tech, software development, and it continues to be a competitive advantage, but we got to position it moving forward. Again, this is another asset mapping inventory perspective. Next slide. Innovation, last couple topics. So innovation is going to be really important forward. If you go on to the next slide, Industry 4.0, everybody should be aware of this. You've all heard about big data and cloud and mobile computing, IoT, artificial intelligence. I'll call it intelligent automation. Every industry, every perspective. Are we educating our workforce in these concepts? Tech is everywhere. And so this sets the stage. If you go on to the next slide, this is something that's going to permeate any type of planning that any company does, any kind of public sector support, and being known as an innovation capital, an innovation city, a 5G city. Look at where Chicago stacks up globally. We just pulled this out of one of the surveys that we look at and some of the clients. So this is a bright spot for Chicago. Is it a bright spot for Illinois? Innovation is a big part of the future of any of our competitiveness. And now is, again, it's a time to be thinking about what that is in terms of innovation, tech transfer, all these types of things, and relative to universities working economic development efforts with them. Very, very important factor. Next slide. And lastly, targeted industries. One of the things I think there's probably some folks in here that are from rural Illinois, not all Chicago, right? This is about the state of Illinois. Agritech is so hot. So I want to leave kind of with some hope and thoughts and ideas about, like, look what's going on in agritech and innovation here in terms of uses of technology, yield development in crops, you know, the whole issue of how they use smart data and all kinds of, I'll call it predictive analytics. They run simulations and models. You know, Iowa's big into this. So again, competing with the surrounding states. How do you position Illinois to be the top agritech, you know, ecosystem in the world, making sure the Archer Daniel Midlands and all those companies that are part of this chamber can take this to the next level. And again, that's planning not just at the private sector level, but the public sector supporting private sector initiatives and working together. Next slide. So with that, I just want to leave with, what is Illinois' attraction and retention value proposition? How do we work together? Again, PPP is so important. I believe it's one of the biggest ways moving forward. I was just on the phone this morning. We did the Amazon HQ2 support project for the state of New York, our practice. And they've come back and they said they're devastated, obviously, in the city of New York and the state of New York. What are some ideas they should be putting on the table relative to public-private sector partnership like they've never done before? Because that's what it's going to take to elevate and move us into this recovery, not to go it alone. And of course, how are we going to expand, work with companies regionally, nationally, and globally? Globally should be on here. And then supporting growth, true growth. Like, there's little shoots of corn coming out of the ground. It's corn season in Illinois, knee high by the 4th of July, right? I'm a Midwestern guy. There's shoots coming out. So now that those little corn shoots are coming out of the fields, how are we going to put the right fertilizer? Where do we grow and how do we take care of that? How do we tend to that? And it's a really exciting time, I'm going to say. I know it's a really challenging time, but it has to be an exciting time to reimagine, rethink. And if you go on to the next slide, you know, really think about how we're going to be competitive moving forward. So thank you for letting me talk about future opportunity, and I'll turn it back to Laura.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you, John, for this insightful presentation. I think we all learned, you know, what we need to do, what the homework is, not just from the standpoint of the private sector, but also the engagement that organizations like the Illinois Chamber of Commerce has in shaping public policy, and in particular, all the policies that facilitate business and the attraction of business for this regional market. So thank you so much. While I'm basically organizing some of the questions that are coming from the audience, I would like to ask you both about small and medium-sized companies. 90% of all companies across the world, this is the truth in the United States, it is the truth in Europe, and you know, obviously in Illinois, 90% of all companies, registered companies, are the small and medium-sized companies. They are the backbone of our economy, and they are the ones that basically support the majority of jobs, the creation of jobs. It's a very, very difficult sector, and it has been hammered by this crisis with very little support and very little cash flow, given their, you know, capital structural issues, in order to invest in infrastructure and especially in innovation, so they can better adapt to this crisis. I was reading some statistics about, you know, 80% of most small and medium-sized companies across the world do not have a digitalization plan. Mm-hmm. How, you know, can this specific sector transform themselves in order to survive this pandemic, this new normal, and what is the role of policy and governments in order to help those small and medium-sized companies and those jobs, those workers that work for those small and medium-sized companies to retrain and reset and rethink their own business models so they can survive, especially those companies that are in the losers, column, basically.
Well, that is a grand question with many different segments, but the first thing that popped into my head is leadership. Again, you're thinking about separating from the pack, reimagining, rethinking, embracing digitalization, the digital core, I'll call it. That's where it starts with leadership, to be open to new models and business models, which aren't expensive. That's about getting your people together and talking about new trends, new perspective, new channels, new opportunities. That's what we've done with our own company. It's very hard though, but we intentionally got together and talked about new channels and where we point our resources. You might have to even blow up your own business model and actually look at pivoting into new opportunities. By the way, small and medium-sized companies are more flexible and agile. The big Titanics, it's harder for them. So if you've got that leadership and the agility and the flexibility to reimagine and quickly pivot to new channels and opportunities, because there are opportunities slowly coming into place. Yes, they've been hammered. And John made a good point. We might have to make some changes on talent perspective, but that's where it starts, is leadership and being intentional.
Yeah, and I would add a couple of things. One, for SMEs that are looking at sales, I talked about focusing on international markets. That used to be much more difficult and more cost prohibitive. And now with the adoption of technologies and to be able to sell into e-commerce platforms, or to even to be able to identify your distributors digitally by Teams and Zoom and GoToMeeting, what I've seen is that companies that are now reaching out, virtually, are actually developing the relationships that you used to go to meet somebody to see if you were a good fit to develop a relationship. And so from a cost perspective, you're taking that cost down. So when you actually take that trip to that distributor in Germany that you're about to appoint, or Singapore or Thailand or wherever that is, you're already ready to do business. And I think you've shortened the curve of that development. You're going to get into market faster. On the public sector side, I'd like to comment. I think Bob's comments on public-private partnerships is really accurate and very astute. And I think a state like Illinois should look at two Asian examples, both in Southeast Asia, Singapore and Malaysia. And what they've done is they've put together business incubators, business accelerators that have really allowed companies to prosper with a little bit of funding, but also an infrastructure and a community that's connected with our educational institutions. And if you look at the R&D and now the commercialization of that, those two markets are leading the world in getting SMEs up and running.
Thank you, John, and Bob, for the response. I have one question coming from the audience here that is general. It encompasses some others that I just read. That said, what trends have you seen regarding use of foreign trade zones to mitigate supply chain risks?
Sorry, the use of foreign what? I didn't catch it.
I'm sorry, foreign trade zones.
Oh, foreign trade zones. Oh, got it. Okay. Well, to mitigate risk, I mean, foreign trade zones actually are getting a little bit of a rebirth right now because of the issues that reared their ugly heads in the U.S.-China trade tensions. And so even though using, when you import into the local geography out of the foreign trade zone, you have to pay tax on it. But it allows you to keep inventory. It allows you to lower the cost of having it there. It allows you to do value-added assembly. In some cases, it allows you to reallocate your harmonized codes in a free trade zone because you're doing something in country. And I think you're going to see a bit of a resurgence of free trade zones globally right now.
Yeah, I'd agree quickly. We currently have a client who is going to have reversed their make versus buy effort, where they actually decided to outsource everything to China over 10 years ago. They're actually going to reshore some of their activity, but they can't stop the sourcing, right? You can't source everything immediately in the United States. So if you're going to source out of Asia and other parts, you could actually clear customs near Kansas City or Chicago, so that's going to be, so that they're still relevant. And I think that I agree with John, they could be more important to make sure they keep that sourcing strategy stable and confident.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that is where policy plays an enormous role in establishing the concept of trade zones, and especially in Illinois, and do a comparative analysis of how trade zones are conceptualized in different jurisdictions, so you gain tracks and see what everybody is doing. Perhaps, for example, I read some interesting proposals where you dissociate the physical concept of the trade zone and the legal or soft, concept of trade zone. So actually, there was not necessarily a physical component, but a sort of a statute or a status on the part of the company to give flexibilization to where they feel is best location for them, instead of forcing companies to actually go to a particular zone that may or may not be a fit for everybody. So I think that is an interesting sort of innovation in terms of how do you think about that. So I have another question. Let me just scroll down out here, that is asking about actually if you have a shovel-ready site, okay, what is the best agency, in your opinion, within the state of Illinois to request certification from? For example, Illinois Super Site, Intersect Illinois, Comet. Is there anybody else? And I can actually go ahead and answer that question, but I'm going to leave this up to John and Robert to comment in terms of their experience dealing with the agencies in Illinois for green, investment project coming into this area.
Well, since we're right in the middle of it, looking at mega sites all around the state of Illinois right now for a very large project, there's a little bit of confusion right now about who owns what, right? So yeah, Intersect Illinois is the attraction agency. Illinois Department of Commerce, I'll call it, is the programmatic funding agency. You have regional economic development groups, you have utilities. So many people want to certify sites, so and develop these opportunities. So the bottom line is you want to make it as easy as possible for the client, right? And you want to be able to have a single point of contact. So you could call any of those people. They all should be talking. They should be streamlined. So if you talk to ComEd or utility or state or Department of Commerce, you call one, you call all of them. So for me, my last comment on that, it's less about the agency. It's about how intake and communication works across the state, because speed to value is still very important for these clients.
Absolutely. I think so. It's not a question of, what agency or what, functions they have. It's about one-stop shop for the party that has an interest in coming here and act quickly, in securing that interest. On that, I actually, the International Business Council of the Chamber has developed along with Global Partners Program, which Newmark is actually one of our members, has put together a soft landing process where basically, we triage those inquiries, and then we are able to send the inquirer to the right, either private or public agency, in order to have that kind of meeting of interest and convening of interest in one, space. And we're currently working on a few of those projects with companies from different, some are European companies and some of them are Latin American companies, etc. So go ahead.
Yeah, so I just want to mention, I guess maybe I'm a super user when it comes to this topic. So, I mean, there's other states around the United States where we've known the same person for 10 to 12 years. We know to call John or Mary, and we call them within
Yep.
5 minutes. We know all the sites, we know where to get everything, how they use technology in their websites. So this is a really important factor for the state of Illinois. It can't be confusing. It has to be well organized, aligned, collaborative, and never mind the agency. Let's just make sure this portfolio is positioned for the right industries that John talked about, right? All those foreign companies, when they do make the decision in the board, they want to go fast. And they want to make sure they land in the right place quickly, and again, speed to value.
And they need to understand things. It needs to be clear, it needs to be easy. And if you look at globally, the economic development agencies that are the best at this, they are one stop. It's very transparent. You land there, data is presented, information, and there's somebody to hold your hand. And if you can do that, investors will feel good and they'll keep coming back.
So on that, let me ask you a question, both of you. What would be the highlight of Illinois and the challenges? What are the problems and what are the good things in terms of drivers for foreign companies to come and invest in this region?
Well, I'll start the process, and I like the fact that John can end from the international side. The whole issue of our fiscal instability and pension crisis and things of that sort, it's a real factor. Almost every site selector, when we think of Illinois, it comes up in the conversation. So you got to change the narrative on that. And that's a systemic issue. Doesn't mean it's going to be solved overnight, but it has to be addressed in terms of bonded indebtedness and all of those issues, because that relates back into infrastructure and funding for things that impacts the private sector. So that's the one big, I'll call it 800-pound gorilla in the room. And it's in the news, and that has to be addressed head on. But again, I think I highlighted in my presentation, quality of life, the airports, the talent base here. There's a world-class city that's recognized on the global stage. And look at the brands that we have. Fortune 1000 companies, all innovating and spinning out opportunities. But it's about telling your story. We don't have a consistent story across the globe. I think John, there's other states that you work for that if you mention them Asia, they know exactly what they're all about. Illinois, what's the story? What's the brand? For me, it's about storytelling, right?
Yeah, and the brand of Illinois is very weak internationally. Chicago's brand is very strong. And so, the state and the city shouldn't see that as a problem. They should see that as a strength, because what you need is some way to get your foot in the door. So selling Chicago and its diversity and its connectivity and its talent base and its corporate headquarters as a way to get those foreigners to come to Illinois and learn what Illinois has to offer beyond that is a great way to leverage. And so that goes back to being able to work across the economic development agencies within a state and in cities. Utilize what people know. The world knows Chicago. They don't know Illinois. And, that's unfortunate.
I like if this is being recorded, I'm fine. I hope it gets sent to a lot of people at very high levels. 10 years ago, I was sitting in a boardroom in the state of Wisconsin and presenting a final report for Be Bold, Wisconsin. That was their initiative. They were on a burning platform for manufacturing. They said, we've got to do something. It was a 30-person firm, private sector, public sector, sitting in a room, and we were presenting our results about, what are the activities and actions you need to put yourself back to become a top 20 business state. 10 years later, they've made some great progress. So Illinois needs to come up with their own Be Bold Illinois effort and really take a shot at really catapulting themselves to this echelon of competitiveness. that's a top 20 business state, maybe even a top 10. And that's a bold move, but go big or go home right now, because now's the time to rethink, right? Reimagine, to separate
Absolutely.
yourself from the pack, right? This is the time. And I hope that's the case. And maybe we've spurred some thoughts and ideas today in this presentation, Laura, to help everybody in the state of Illinois understand that.
Absolutely. I think one of the main goals of the International Business Council, it was really put Illinois on the map for in having that kind of direct connections between Chamber of Commerce across the world to host delegations when they come, and really push that narrative that, as you said, is kind of unclear what are the advantage, of Illinois, and is that sort of collaborative effort from an urban global city, but at the same time that more rural or traditional spaces where could be a great balance and talk team for companies that, as John was saying, and they can come through Chicago, but more likely than not end up immediately or within 24 months setting up a secondary location, perhaps in other communities when they know better the state and they realize the potential of some of the most outside of the city areas. And actually, this would be an interesting question of how you see this crisis proposing or encouraging more rural communities to prepare themselves and be more attractive for this kind of investment, due to the fact that people, are a little bit afraid of concentration at the moment because of social distancing, and also the cost savings of being in areas where perhaps the cost of real estate, land, just doing business in general is it's more affordable for especially for that medium-sized sector that I think is underrepresented and I will say supported in general.
Well, never waste a good crisis. So again, it's about attitude. I know some people are really hurting right now. It's a very challenging time, but it is an opportunity to, maybe you can't get together physically, but you can. I mean, technology is enabling many things that never could happen in the past. So now's the time for people to talk, and nobody's sitting still. As John mentioned, there's international countries that are positioning their strategies. I know there's states and utilities around the United States. I know because they call me. I'm on webinars. They're planning. They're doing exactly what John said. I mean, they're positioning right now. Is Illinois doing that? We're getting calls. So, never waste a good crisis. Carpe diem. I sound a little bit too much like a Newt Rockne football coach from the Green Bay here, but that's leadership. What's the next big thing? Reimagine, reposition, pivot. And this is an opportunity for Illinois to reposition its whole corporate image and public sector support image of corporations around the globe.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think cities are at the biggest risk right now, the high-rise office towers and things, because this pandemic has made us realize that you can work virtually and remotely and be just as productive and sometimes more productive. It was a big concern when this started, productivity, and I think what companies are realizing is how productive people are being. So I think rural Illinois and rural America will be able to offer a lower cost living, a higher quality of life for workers that will not need to be in a downtown city like Chicago. So I think it will allow, with some rethinking, a rebranding and remarketing of rural Illinois.
Well, and I think you cannot say it best, to end this series. There is an opportunity here. We just need to be smart about it. We need to do our homework, definitely rethink the way that we think about our city and our state, and you know, sort of push, I think, from the standpoint of the private sector and organizations like the Illinois Chamber of Commerce, be at the table when those policies are being crafted, so we can do the best we can individually for our companies, for our workers, but also for the health of our state and the economic future of the potential that we have. And that sometimes, as Bob has said, it doesn't get out, especially to the international community. So thank you all for participating in this webinar today. It was very, very helpful, very thoughtful, and very interesting. I hope for everybody that is listening today. Thank you, our audience, for participating in a sunny, wonderful Chicago afternoon. And I hope we can see each other again shortly, hopefully in person, and have this kind of discussions to better our state and better our position in the world. Thank you. And I think Lori Sylvie will finish this webinar saying some things about how you can access the recording. And I believe there is a survey that will be out as well. So thank you, everybody. Again, thank you, Bob. Thank you, John. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. And yes,
Take
this
care.
presentation also qualified for continuing education credits. So you should have received an email this morning with the PowerPoint as well as a CEU request form. If you did not receive the email, please let me know and I'll send it your way. The recording will be available as of tomorrow, and I will send a link to all participants for that as well. Thank you to all of our participants for joining us today. Thank you, John and Bob, for the presentation. And this will conclude our webinar for the day. So have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much.